I'll be talking about the monetary and fiscal policies to fix inflationary, recessionary, and stagflationary gaps. Here we have a graph of the economy's long and short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand at full employment equilibrium, where the unemployment is 5% and CPI is 3%. This graph is of an inflationary gap. Aggregate demand is the problem curve since it is shifted to the right. In this situation, price level is high and unemployment is low. Here we have the graph of a recessionary gap. In a recession, aggregate demand is shifted to the left. This is because price levels are lower than equilibrium and unemployment is higher. When the economy is experiencing stagflation or cost-push inflation, the supply curve is now the problem curve. Short-run aggregate supply is shifted to the left, and price levels and unemployment are both higher than equilibrium. An expansionary fiscal policy would either be to reduce taxes, which would increase consumer spending, or to increase government spending, which would directly increase the quantity of real GDP. The goal here is to increase aggregate demand. A contractionary fiscal policy would either be to raise taxes, which would decrease consumer spending, or to decrease government spending, which would directly decrease the quantity of real GDP. This would have a negative effect on aggregate demand. A contractionary fiscal policy must be used to fix an inflationary gap. This means that we will either raise taxes or lower government spending. Both have a negative effect on the quantity of real GDP. This would cause aggregate demand to decrease and the curve would shift to the left. An expansionary fiscal policy must be used to fix a recessionary gap. This means that we will either lower taxes or increase government spending. Both have a positive effect on the quantity of real GDP. This would cause aggregate demand to increase, and the curve would shift to the right. For stagflation, a contractionary policy would decrease aggregate demand and is used when decreasing price level is the main concern. An expansionary policy would increase aggregate demand and is used when increasing unemployment is the main concern. Open market operations are the least powerful monetary policy. They are expansionary when the Fed buys securities to increase the money supply and lower interest rates. They are contractionary when the Fed sells securities to decrease the money supply and increase interest rates. Discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks for short-term loans. Expansionary DR is when it is lowered by the Fed. More banks will borrow money, so money supply increases, which decreases interest rates. Contractionary DR is when it is increased by the Fed. Money supply decreases and interest rates increase. The reserve requirement is money that banks need to keep on reserve. It's typically 10%, and when the Fed lowers it, money supply increases, which lowers interest rates, making it an expansionary policy. It's contractionary when the Fed raises it, because the money supply decreases, which raises interest rates. To fix inflation, the Fed could either sell securities, raise the discount rate, or raise the reserve requirement, all contractionary policies. These would lower the money supply, which would then increase interest rates. Higher interest rates means that consumer spending and investments would decrease, lowering aggregate demand. For a recession, the Fed could either buy securities, lower the discount rate, or lower the reserve requirement, all expansionary policies. These would increase the money supply, which would decrease interest rates. Therefore, consumer spending and investments would increase, having a positive effect on aggregate demand. For stagflation, a contractionary policy would be used to decrease money supply and increase interest rates, lowering aggregate demand. This policy is used when the main concern is fixing the price level. An expansionary policy is used to fix stagflation when fixing unemployment is the main concern. The money supply would increase, lowering interest rates and having an overall positive effect on aggregate demand.